Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 terrifying stories from deep within the Appalachian forests. Stories of people who ventured too far and came face to face with something they'll never forget. From a group of friends who lost one of their own, to a man who hears a voice calling out to him in the darkness, and finally, a birthday celebration in a remote cabin that turns into a night of pure horror. Before we begin, I just want to thank everyone who commented on the last video and shared where you're watching from. It's genuinely amazing to see that this community is growing from all over the world, and that we're all connected. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Back in 1987, when I was 23, something happened to me and my friends that still haunts me to this day. Everyone's names in this story have been changed, but every single detail is true. I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but the people involved in this story are real people, and something truly terrible happened. I need to tell this to someone, but since I have no right to stir up this story again, at least not by using real names, I'll leave those out. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind is that this all happened many years ago, in 1987, at a time when things were drastically different, from the way you asked for help to the way investigations were conducted. Maybe that's why we never got any real answers about what happened to one of us. So, in October of that year, me and 5 friends decided to do a week-long hike through the Appalachian Mountains. We had already done several hikes and camping trips together, but never in this part of the country, and never so far into the wilderness. We were perfectly aware that our plan was ambitious. About 80 miles from the north entrance down to Pactola Lake. We wanted to disconnect from the city, escape our jobs, and just breathe. Laura was our guide of sorts. She'd been in the National Guard, skilled with maps and compasses, and she kept us all feeling relatively safe. She had always been the kind of person who takes charge of a situation and knows exactly what to do. She was more than prepared to help us survive in nature. What she wasn't prepared for was how cruel and disturbed the minds of some people hiding in that very nature could be. So, we stocked up on food and supplies at a small store in Rapid City. When I mentioned where we were headed, the cashier went pale. "People disappear out there all the time," she said. "There are things out there you don't want to see." We didn't really react at the time because the truth is, we had already heard plenty of ghost stories and other tales about creatures haunting the forest. But in reality, there was never any real proof that any of those stories were true, and we weren't about to give up our adventure just because some people like to make things up. We didn't confront the lady. Everyone believes what they want. We just smiled. But as we were loading the groceries into the car, the man who had been behind us in line came over and told us not to worry about what people said around there. As long as we stayed on the trail, everything would be fine. We thanked him and went on our way. Still, the truth is, that interaction with the man left me more unsettled than I admitted. One thing is people and their superstitions. Another is someone who seemed to know what he was talking about, telling us to stay on the trail. It didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a warning. And the truth is, we were planning to leave the trail. But no one commented on it, and I didn't want to break the group's spirit, so we just kept going. The first 2 days of hiking were perfect, except for one situation that we kind of ignored. Spirits were high, we were young and in shape, and the forest was beautiful in that crisp October air. Near the end of the first trail, close to the area where we planned to leave the path and explore off-trail, we spotted a camp in the distance. But it was the strangest camp I had ever seen. The tents were in terrible shape, old and torn apart. But worse were the 3 people outside. Each one of them was wearing a white mask. It shocked us not only because of the masks themselves, but because they were wearing them around each other. If they were trying to scare someone, it would make more sense. But no, they were sitting in a circle around a fire, talking to one another. Even though it was obviously disturbing, we were far enough away that they hadn't seen us. At least I thought they hadn't. So we just stayed silent, kept our distance, and got out of there fast. By the next day, our second day, nothing had happened, and we were keeping a good pace. By nightfall, none of us were even talking about those 3 anymore. They had already slipped from our memory. But the third night changed everything, and when I say everything, I really mean it. One of us went into that forest and never came back out. That night, we did exactly what we had done the 2 nights before. We set up camp in a clearing near a creek, splitting between 2 tents. We spent some time around the fire talking, and then one by one everyone drifted off to bed. Even though I was one of the first to lie down, around 3 in the morning I still couldn't sleep. Melissa was awake too, complaining about her back. So we were sitting in her tent, quietly playing cards. That's when we heard it. Soft, crunching footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was someone going to the bathroom, normal in a big group like ours. But 5 minutes passed, then 10, and we didn't hear anything else. Then I looked up from the cards at Melissa and saw the panic on her face. She had peeked through the small window in the side of the tent and had clearly seen something that terrified her. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream. I leaned over the flap and saw them. 3 figures, maybe 20 yards from our camp, standing completely still. Masks covered their faces, crude, featureless cloth that hid every expression. And their clothes were ragged, like they had made them themselves. They weren't moving. They weren't talking. They were just watching. I knew immediately it was the same 3 we had seen days before. I gave Melissa the same signal, covering my mouth to stop myself from screaming. Melissa barely breathed. For what felt like an eternity, we didn't move. Then, the zipper of the other tent slid open. We didn't know if it was our friends coming out to investigate the noise, or those 3 who might have moved over to unzip it. We both leaned to see, but it all happened too fast for us to react. A scream cut through the forest. Sharp and short. It was a man's scream, but it didn't sound like anyone we knew. At the same moment, Laura rushed into our tent. She shoved a knife into our hands, her face a mix of panic and the cold determination of someone on a mission. She said the men were back. She didn't know what they wanted, but whatever it was, we had to be ready to fight and run. Then she told us Tom had disappeared. No one knew where he was. She left the tent again and took up a defensive stance right in front of it. Now that the tent was wide open, we could see them clearly. They were still standing there, in exactly the same position, just staring at us. Laura yelled that we were armed and that she had experience. It wasn't true that we were armed, but it was true she had experience, and with the right motivation, she probably could have handled them. But they didn't react. They just stayed put, watching. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my life. She called out for Tom again, but nothing. The forest around us was completely silent. Nobody moved, waiting for the other to make the first move. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Honestly, I really don't. But Laura insists it was only a short time. They simply turned around and walked back into the woods until we couldn't see them anymore. None of us moved. We didn't know if they would come back. The only thing we knew for sure was that Tom was still missing. We called out for him several times throughout the night. But nothing. None of us dared to venture into the dark forest. By 7, the sun had risen enough that we felt safe moving, searching the area to see where he might be. After an hour with no luck, we knew we had to get help. An investigation was launched that lasted more than 3 weeks. Several volunteers joined the search, but Tom was never found. The only thing discovered was one sock with blood on it. Nothing more. Almost 40 years have passed since then, and we've been told the investigation has been reopened. I hope that this time we'll finally get some answers about what might have happened the night we lost our friend, and that maybe some light will be shed on who those 3 men really were. Get ready. Because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely ridiculous, and, at the same time, for someone who went through and lived what happened, terrifying. Because what I'm about to tell you has been clawing at my brain for over 20 years now. I haven't told a single person face to face, because I know exactly how it sounds. Completely unhinged. But it happened, and the silence has been eating me alive. As I've seen some people say in this type of situation, maybe putting it out here will help me move on. Although, I suspect the only thing it will do is remind me how fragile we really are when we think we're alone in the woods. Either way, here it is. This all went down in October of 1999. If you weren't there, or you were too young, you probably don't realize how different everything was back then. Cell phones already existed, but there wasn't even close to the kind of dependence there is today. No constant tether to someone on the other end of a screen. When you went into the woods in '99, you were gone. If something happened, you were on your own. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, although I think the magic has been completely lost. My goal in saying this is simply to give a fact that in a way is important to the story. I didn't have a cell phone. So, going back to that time, I used to be a hardcore hiker, backpacking every chance I got through Tennessee, North Carolina, even up into Virginia. For years, I'd hit the trails almost every other weekend. I wasn't reckless, but I loved going solo. No chatter, no phones, just me and the sound of my boots on dirt. It was the closest thing to peace I ever found. But life got in the way. Work piled up, relationships went sideways, and before I knew it, years had passed since I'd done a real trip. Until that fall of '99. when I finally snapped out of it and decided I was done wasting time. I dug out my old gear, cleaned off my stove, unfolded the creased paper topo maps, and picked a trail in the Smokies I'd always wanted to try. A stretch so remote that back then there wasn't any other trail nearby. I gave myself 4 days, enough to shake the rust off, but not so long I'd be dragging myself home broken. I prepped like I always did. Extra food, emergency pack, compass, and a battered flashlight with spare batteries. But I can admit now that I was cocky. I thought the years hadn't dulled me as much as they had. Day 1 was perfect. Cool breeze, clear sky, and the constant sound of leaves being crushed underfoot. My legs burned, but it was that good burn. The kind that makes you remember you're alive. The forest smelled like damp moss and old pine needles, and the streams were still running high from September rains. I didn't see another human after the parking lot. That night, though, things shifted. It wasn't anything obvious, just this nagging sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I'd set up camp beside a small clearing, got a fire going, cooked my usual dehydrated meal, and the whole time, it felt like someone was watching from the tree line. I kept glancing up mid-bite, expecting to catch a pair of eyes reflecting back. But there was nothing but darkness. It's important to say that at this point I wasn't scared at all. I was just alert. To survive when we're completely isolated, you can't just switch off your intuition. It exists for a reason. Besides, I'd already encountered my fair share of crazy people on trails I'd hiked before. In all those cases when I ran into weirdos or more dangerous situations, what saved me was precisely using my intuition, trusting my instincts. So this experience wasn't going to be any different. Sure, it's true that I hadn't gone on a trail like this in a few years, but I still knew what it felt like when something wasn't right, when you're being watched. So that night I took the proper precautions. I kept my food away from the campsite and laid several dry branches around the tent. If someone or some animal approached, I'd have time to hear it. But, aside from the feeling, nothing else happened that night. So I moved on. The second day, I pushed deeper. The path narrowed, climbed hard in spots, cut across ridges where the wind howled like a freight train. It was beautiful. But every so often, I'd get this flash of movement just beyond the corner of my vision. Once I swore I saw something slipping behind a tree about 50 yards off. A shape low to the ground, pale against the dark bark. Obviously, I stood still trying to figure out what kind of animal it could be, and whether I was in danger. But after a few minutes, nothing happened. It was as if nothing had been there at all. By the time I set camp again, I was a bit on edge. I'd had some uncomfortable signs during the day, and I knew perfectly well they weren't monkeys in my head. My fire that night felt less like comfort and more like a barrier, light keeping whatever was out there away. I was stirring the coals when I heard it. Not footsteps, exactly, but something heavy, shifting on soft ground. Too deliberate for the wind, and too steady to be a random sound of the forest. My chest locked up. Bears crossed my mind. But this didn't sound like that. It wasn't crashing. It wasn't snuffling around. It was controlled and maybe calculated. Instinctively, I grabbed my light and swept the trees. But once again, I couldn't see anything. The fire also didn't help. It was great for seeing what was close, but it obscured anything beyond its light. Then, out of the corner of the firelight, I saw it. A low and almost crawling movement, balanced on 4 limbs, sliding between the trunks with this wrong, uneven rhythm. My brain screamed, "Animal." But no animal I'd ever seen moved like that. Its skin, or fur, or whatever it was, seemed too pale, almost gray-blue in the firelight, like something that hadn't seen sunlight in a long, long time. In fact, I'd only managed to see it among the trees because it clearly wasn't an animal that needed to camouflage itself. Even so, I could only see part of it. My brain was working overtime trying to figure out what kind of animal it was and what the best plan would be. And then, my own voice came out of the dark, clear as if I was standing 5 feet behind me. "Wanna play?" It was like the ground fell out from under me. Cold shot through my whole body. My heart stuttered. I didn't move, and I didn't breathe. Every instinct screamed to react, to do something. But I knew, with a certainty I can't explain, that answering back would be the end of me. I sat frozen, staring into the trees, gripping the handle of my knife like a lifeline. I already knew not to leave the fire. I stayed as close to it as possible. I kept the flame alive, feeding it every piece of wood I had, praying it would keep the dark at bay. Whatever was out there didn't leave. I could hear it circling, shifting, sometimes close enough I swore I could feel the vibration in the dirt. It never crashed through the underbrush. It slid, like it knew exactly how to move without a sound. I know it's hard to picture what I'm saying, but this is exactly what I felt at the time. And then again, I heard my own voice. At this point, I didn't understand what was said, but something was clearly said, and the voice was still mine. I wanted to scream, to charge into the woods swinging, to scare it off, to do anything but sit there like prey. But I knew in my bones that reacting was what it wanted. So I stayed still, clenched my teeth, eyes locked on the tree line, until dawn broke. When the sun finally lit the forest, I didn't waste a second. I didn't pack my tent. I didn't touch my stove. I shoved my emergency kit into my pack and bolted down the trail like hell was chasing me. I ran until my legs were jelly and until I saw the gravel road and my car. Then I just peeled out without looking back. I've never told anyone except my brother until now. Not because I don't want to be believed, but because I don't even believe myself. What do you even call that? A hallucination? A psychotic break? But the thing is, I don't drink from random streams. I don't eat berries. I didn't take anything that could have poisoned me. The idea that I randomly hallucinated my own voice out there feels as absurd as the alternative. And yet, I can still hear it. The tone, the cadence. It was, without any shadow of a doubt, my exact voice. It's been over 2 decades and I haven't set foot back in the Smokies. I don't know if I ever will. Everything I'm about to tell you happened at the end of October 1987, when I had just turned 20 years old. Just so you know, things back then were very different from what they are now. We were more united as a society, and it breaks my heart to see how divided we've become. Anyway, that's just something I wanted to share. Like I said, I had just turned 20 and, to celebrate properly, my closest group of friends and I decided to spend 5 days in a cabin isolated deep in the woods. It wasn't just any cabin either. It belonged to one of my friend's uncles. 4 guys who had grown up together in the same little corner of Western Virginia, just close enough to the Appalachian ridges to think the mountains were our backyard. The cabin was more like an oversized hunting shack, set back in the woods, no electricity, no running water. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and to us, that was paradise. We didn't have any plans for those days except drinking beer, talking by the campfire, and maybe going on a hike or 2. The first 3 nights were exactly that. The cabin was rough. Old timber, warped shutters, a wood stove that filled the room with smoke if you fed it too much at once. But we didn't care. We cooked hot dogs on sticks, drank cheap beer until we couldn't feel the cold, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the wind moving through the trees. It was simple, and it was good. Those were definitely good times. The 4th and final night was when things changed. That night was much colder and damper than the ones before. Instead of being outside by a fire, we stayed inside the cabin. As usual, we kept the windows slightly open to let some air in and keep the smoke from building up inside. Around midnight, as we were sitting on the couch, Evan and I both saw something. The problem was, we saw the same thing, but in opposite windows. Out there in the pitch-black forest, something glimmered back at us. A pair of eyes. We both jumped up at the same time and realized we were looking at the same thing. Luckily, we reacted fast. All 4 of us understood what was happening and rushed to close the windows and double-check the door. We stayed alert. None of us knew what was out there. All we had seen was what looked like a pair of eyes low to the ground. We weren't exactly scared yet. The area was known for wild animals, and since the eyes were so low, we figured it might be wolves. The fact that we had seen more than one pair of eyes and seen them in opposite windows almost confirmed it. They must have been animals moving in a pack, possibly hunting together. At that point, we still hadn't closed the shutters, so we could still see out into the woods. But there was nothing more to see than the vastness of the forest and the darkness between the trees. At one point, Frederick said what he'd seen wasn't an animal. He said it in such an absolute, unnerving way that I immediately knew he wasn't joking. We shut the shutters then, but even so, we still didn't know what we had seen. Frederick himself, after saying that, couldn't explain what he'd seen. He just kept saying it wasn't an animal. He didn't know what it was. Maybe a very sick or deformed animal. We kept pressing him with questions, and he just said he didn't know, but that the best thing was to keep the shutters closed. For hours, we heard noises outside the cabin. Obviously, none of us were going to sleep that night. We heard something crawling around outside, something scratching at the wood. It was absolutely terrifying. I really thought it was a pack of wolves, maybe hungry ones. But then we heard whatever it was climb onto the roof and start moving from one side to the other. Wolves were agile, but I didn't think they could climb that high. Maybe cougars, I thought. But cougars rarely hunted in groups. All through that night we talked through every possible scenario. We grabbed whatever objects we could use to defend ourselves in case the cabin wasn't strong enough and gave way. The idea was terrifying, mostly because we didn't know what was on the other side. We even talked about the possibility that it could be people. But Frederick said, if they were people, they were highly deformed. Not to mention, I had seen the eyes low to the ground, which meant if it was a person, they were crawling on all fours. The idea that it could be people was horrifying. Not just because we didn't know their intentions, but because we didn't know what could be happening to them to make them act like that. At that time, it was common to hear talk about feral people, but nothing had ever been proven. When morning finally came and we hadn't heard any noises for a while, we opened the shutters to look outside. Nothing. The forest was still and serene, just like it had been every other day. But the ground was clearly trampled, like several people or animals had been circling the cabin. We couldn't make out distinct footprints, at least not from where we were. So the doubt remained about what had been out there. We packed up the rest of our things, and only when we opened the door and stepped outside did we realize it couldn't have been animals. The scratching noises we'd heard the night before had been to make all those marks on the cabin. The cabin was completely covered in them, but they weren't just random scratches that any animal could have made. They were symbols, drawings even, something only a person could have done. We got out of there as fast as we could. When we told my friend's uncle what had happened, he and a couple of his friends searched the woods around the cabin, trying to figure out what had gone on, but they never found anything.